Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Roderick Flood, the Provost of the College, and I'm delighted to see you all here this evening. Last Sunday, the 28th of November, was the 350th anniversary of the occasion when, after a lecture at Gresham College, a group of gentlemen met in a room in the college and resolved to found the Royal Society. Maybe this lecture will have similar important results. But at much the same time, in the time of ferment in English history, what was to become the Stock Exchange, of course, began to form in the coffee houses of the city, following the foundation about a century earlier of the Royal Exchange by Sir Thomas Gresham and his father. And all these institutions share the characteristic of being a meeting place for the exchange of ideas, of information, of money. And of course, together with the finance houses and other businesses of the city, they made up in the 17th century and still make up today the leading financial centre in the world. And we, Gresham, supported by the Mercers and the Corporation of London, are delighted to continue to be a marketplace for the exchange of ideas. And it's a particular pleasure in this context and a privilege to welcome to Gresham the chairman of the Stock Exchange, Dr. Chris Gibson-Smith. He was educated at Durham University, secured his PhD at Newcastle and an MBA at Stanford. He joined BP in 1970 and had a most distinguished career in that company. He became chairman of the Stock Exchange in 2003 and also in 2006 chairman of British Land. He's an eloquent commentator on and spokesman for the city, and he's steering the Stock Exchange at the moment through some difficult times. But tonight he's going to be speaking on the much wider topic of a new economic model for Europe, building sustainable growth. We welcome you and ask you to give us your thoughts.
Provost, thank you, and congratulations on the very clever early part of that introduction. Welcome to you all for being courageous enough to come out on a day like this and brave the weather. It's an honor to be speaking here in an institution with this tradition. And I think for those of us with deep links into the city, we take pride in the fact that institutions like Gresham are still so vibrant after 400 years. There's something about the city that seems to confer remarkable longevity on its social and cultural institutions. Also, as the Provost said, our world's not short of large and difficult issues, but it is short of venues for public discussion, and Gresham plays a very important role in providing such a forum. My contribution this evening is going to be close to one of the themes of Thomas Gresham's own life. He made his fortune by helping Edward VI address the large debts that have been accumulated in the Low Countries through poor financial decision-making. And he would have also perhaps recognized the economic challenges that the West now faces with the East, although the Low Countries weren't or aren't quite as far east as China is. His solution in the 16th century was to inflate the value of sterling. And this course of action is probably still very much on the minds of many of our economists and bankers as a way out of the predicaments that we're in and the themes that I'm going to talk about. But we need deeper solutions as well. And I'll use this evening to look at the particular economic challenges that we've designed for ourselves. They bear broad similarities to those in the US, but in detail they're uniquely our own, and they're certainly very different from the challenges and issues of the emerging economies. And I think the big challenge for us in the West at the moment is that the crisis revealed deeper problems that we've been hiding within the structure of our economies for several decades, but in the last 10 years that were growing rapidly. Oh, it's not going away. Over the last few weeks, the economic fragility of parts of the EU has again come to the fore as the ongoing debt problems of Ireland and Portugal. Ireland's challenges have as much to do with ongoing problems with her banks, and we must remember that the ECB did strict tests on the European banks less than a year ago and declared them all fit and worthwhile. So it's more to do with her banks than it is to do with her own lack of prudence in her fiscal affairs. And when we look at Ireland and Portugal, they're in many ways really quite different economies, and Ireland has often been praised during the boom for its controlled public spending, and Portugal, while never as profligate as some, was never praised for its behavior. Where Ireland is now, it's likely to face a 30% fiscal deficit by the end of this year. If we include the costs of the financial sector bailout, while Portugal will get to something like 9%. And that 9% is 3 times the upper limit recommended within the deficit requirements of the Maastricht Treaty. So not good. But in differing ways and to differing degrees, both countries' economic approaches have led to an unsustainable situation. And in the case of Ireland, a large bailout in order to both deal with the local problem and to avoid systemic contagion throughout much of Europe. And we don't know whether we've been successful in that yet. So the question is, among the variations between different European economies, is there a particular approach and set of challenges which in aggregate are specific to Europe, given the similar ultimate economic fates of so many of her countries? At this point, I need to apologize to Germany, who's the major exception to much, not all, but much of what I'm going to say. She survived the crisis with a current account surplus, and she's remained a net exporter throughout. So I do again apologize as I talk broadly about European problems that she has in many instances avoided. Clearly, the extent to which each of our economies experiences these challenges varies. But I suggest there are 4 key areas in particular which define the economic models and frameworks of much of the post-war European social democracy. First, pre-crisis public and private sector debt had already reached, that's pre-crisis, unsustainable levels, particularly here in the United Kingdom, and in the face of the increasing exposure to the future demographic changes. Post-crisis, debt levels in much of Europe will be often close to desperate. Second, the scale of public sector economic participation is well above the optimum level throughout the EU, reducing our competitiveness in a direct and measurable way, and thereby damaging our unique socio-political aspirations. Third, our public and private savings rates are well below optimum. This removes a major stabilizing cushion and pool of investment capital from the economy, and it exposes the unfunded nature of much of Europe's public pension promises. And then fourth, our business funding model in the EU is far too reliant on debt, which now seems obvious, but it's been true for a while. And this has led to systemic instability and increased risk, and has proved incapable of adequately supporting our areas of greatest economic advantage. In the UK, it was only the emergency injection of 200 billion of equity capital into our economy, in addition to the 200 billion of quantitative easing, that finally stabilized the UK economic situation. So to build a European economic model able to compete in the post-crisis world, these 4 weaknesses will need to be addressed. But they're only manifestations of an even deeper issue. And that's essentially a political issue, and it arises from the interplay between ourselves and our leaders. More and more unfundable promises were and are being heaped on today's electorate, either at the expense of essential investment in the short term or at the cost of essential funding in the long term. What we, today's electorate, seem not to understand is that we are simultaneously tomorrow's electorate, and we will be called upon to pay the bills at the moment that we can least afford to, in our retirement. But then we have stopped having public debates of substance. And we, the people, seem content to allow our governments to behave in ways we would deem deeply unwise for our own finances, deeply improper for our corporate finances. And so I welcome the coalition's attempts to deal with some of these issues, but we're at an early stage, and however difficult it gets, they should have our support. Some observations on the credit crisis. Among the mountains of books published on the events of the past 3 years, one of the biggest sellers was a reprinting of Galbraith's classic on the Great Depression. And the city's fond of saying that a crisis occurs when the last person to remember the last one retires. And that rule certainly would have applied this time. But there's a risk that this historical perspective prevents us from learning an even deeper lesson, that unlike previous Western crises, the credit crunch was not just a market correction for an indefinitely expanding economy, it was a pre-tremor, an early warning of a much larger economic event, the emergence of the new economies, of China and India in particular, on their journey to becoming the world's major economic powers. In 2009, the world economy contracted for the first time since the Second World War by 1%, and it was widely reported as a global financial crisis. And the United Kingdom and Germany, their economies fell by 5%, but China continued to grow at nearly 9%, and India continued to grow at nearly 7%. The expansion of China and India, I suggest, is deeply welcome, and it heralds a whole new age in world economic terms and a whole new age in knowledge development for we as a global society. But it's a change that we must learn to deal with. And it's not short-term. Deutsche Bank, for instance, estimates that while the GDP of the Eurozone 16 core countries will expand by a little over 90% by 2030, China will be expanding by 840% during that same period. So the crisis represents a historical moment at which the imbalance between the established and the new economies became unstable. We can go further than that and say that the crisis was in some part only possible because of these transitions. Excess public and private leverage, the credit that crunched, was significantly funded by imported credit from China and the other new economies. This doesn't mean that a crisis or this crisis was inevitable or that the new economies were at fault. It wasn't, and they aren't. It was the combined political, regulatory, and commercial failures of the West within this context that led to the current problems. By 2008, China's trade surplus was $270 billion a year. When you combine that with the rest of Asia and the Middle East, we find that they exported over $3 trillion of surplus savings back to we in the West in the years leading up to that crisis. And these stocks of credit came from the proceeds of exported consumer and industrial goods from the new economies to the West. In effect, China was lending us money to buy their television sets. So against this background, let's return to the first and second core points that state participation and spending in the European economy has grown both uncompetitive and unsustainable. Between 2000 and 2009, and everything really took off in the decade leading up to the crisis, public spending in the UK rose from £343 billion a year to £665 billion a year. The ratio of public and private sector debt to GDP in the UK is now higher than any other major economy in the world except Japan. Across the EU, it rose from 45% of GDP to 51%. By comparison, the United States had seen spending grow from 34 to 42. That's way below the European levels, but it's a historic increase in US terms. And it's one of the ironies of the last two decades of US political life that fiscal prudence was given to the US by the Democrats and fiscal imprudence by the Republicans. This shift is measurably damaging our international competitiveness. Government spending impacts economic growth in a number of negative ways. It reduces innovation in line with a loss of opportunity for competition. It leads to suboptimal and distorted allocation of economic resources. The state is a less efficient service provider as it doesn't experience competitive pressures. Many forms of state spending disincentivize economically optimal decision-making, and civil servants and politicians don't acquire management skills in the same manner as the private sector. But of course, there are many spheres of state influence which we all agree are necessary, which create profound collective good and provide services fundamental to an advanced modern state. So there are deep political questions about the role and extent of the state which we need to be revisiting. Questions of the balance between social and economic goods. And some of these are at the heart of the societal differences between the EU and the US. But if we choose to extend government spending beyond well-established limits of prudence, well, then we have to accept the loss of wealth creation capacity. And as importantly, when we spend beyond our current capacity, sustainable capacity, we will damage the future. It's probable that this is a position now reached by most, if not many, EU nations. Now, I'm not going to deal with the political questions of what individuals can expect from the state, but I'm going to concentrate on the economic questions and, to put it in economic terms, to examine the point at which the marginal benefits of government spending and the marginal costs to growth, employment, and innovation intersect. The academic literature, which includes the European Commission, many famous universities and think tanks, suggests that the optimum amount of state participation in the economy is around 35% of GDP. But this is the key point beyond which public services cease to improve in any significant way, and the economy is gradually weakened. MIT economists estimate that a GDP percentage point increase in state spending leads to a loss of approximately 0.1% loss of GDP growth. So these models suggest that Europe should experience a loss of growth in comparison to the US as a result of our higher public sector participation. And they're supported by the real-world data. The EU 2009 government spending of 15 percentage points above that optimum would imply a growth reduction of around 2.2%. The US, by comparison, should experience a loss of around 1.1%. The actual gap in 2009 was 1.4%, and in most years the gap between the two blocks of economies was in line with the theory at just over 1%. Now, as the government is finding now, and as many commentators have said, the balance between social cohesion and growth is a delicate one, and we don't alter it lightly. But the data clearly show that our government spending is too high and strongly weakens our ability to compete. So now let's look at the debt figures as debt itself. The official public figures don't tell us the full story, or the full extent of our debt, which is significantly worse and even more damaging than most of the public discussion implies. governments of all shapes consistently decline to implement generally accepted accounting practices, although those are their committed formal protocols, and the practices that are forced on commercial firms. And as a result, they leave literally trillions of euros of liabilities off their balance sheets for the public discussion. And as spending has increased, European debts and deficits have expanded to levels which are literally economically dangerous. In the case of the UK, our government claims that net debt grew from 31% of GDP in 2000 to 37% in 2007, but by April this year it had hit 54% of GDP, if we exclude the direct costs of bank rescues. But if we include those rescues, and if we include the off-balance sheet spending on PFIs, and we include the £1.2 trillion of unfunded public sector pensions, and we include the further trillion to 2 trillion of the promises made within the various forms of social contract and the insurance fund, we come to a total potential liability exposure for the UK of £4.9 trillion. 370% of GDP, and that is the number that you would see on a commercial company's balance sheet after it had been audited by public auditors. The European economic model has relied on an expectation of perpetual growth, able to fund today's spending plus promises through tomorrow's wealth. If this was ever a rational assumption, we can begin to see that it probably isn't anymore. Again, in the investment sector, the model's called a Ponzi scheme, and we literally put perpetrators in jail. But we're not alone in this problem. We're all at it. And in the US, hard-fought fiscal conservatism of the 1990s has been eroded over the last few years, with a 1.5% surplus in 2000 slipping to a 3.5% deficit in 2008. They got there through a different, more complex route than we did. They started making advances for their Medicare system. They had the significant cost of their Middle East wars. And then they introduced major tax cuts, which reduced the tax revenues from 20% of GDP to 15% of GDP. Those numbers, by contrast, in Europe has tax revenues of 40% of GDP. And on average, our fiscal deficits have increased to 2.5%. If we add or look at these numbers in the light of the concern of the approaching impact of our aging society, then the likelihood is that we're leaving a large portion of these costs to our children. That isn't what's happening in the new world. In the new economies, and let me take China, which I know well, they're competing from an initial position of a financial surplus, low debt, and future labor supplies, people entering the workplace, measured in the hundreds of millions as their urbanization program continues. At the extreme of what might be considered affordable public sector spending throughout Europe, the figure is 7.3 trillion euros. These figures reflect the fiscal implications of the credit crisis, but they are just the official figures, ignoring all the others that I just gave. And if we look at the impact of the demographic time bomb for the EU, through a simple example here in the UK, there are currently 11,000 people aged over 100 in this country. In 50 years' time, we expect that number to be 350,000 people, equivalent to a city the size of Coventry of people aged over 100. Across Europe, the cost to the public purse of an aging society is currently predicted to increase by 40%. And the dependency ratio, which is the number of people in work to support each person retired, is currently 4:1, and it's going to halve to 2:1. And as we've said, the costs of those in retirement are largely unfunded. Nor are we privately saving enough to fund the cost of longer lives. The OECD assumes that pension savers need to achieve an income replacement rate of 70% to live comfortably. We're currently facing a savings shortfall of around 2 trillion euros a year, or 26% of GDP. The position's got much worse over the last 10 years. In the UK in particular, there's been a large-scale withdrawal of government support for pensions in the UK so that the money can be spent today. The emerging demographics we've just been talking about, the investment markets have performed through a series of crises very poorly for a decade, and the major accountancy changes that we introduced over a decade ago have enormously increased the volatility and risk for companies of having pension liabilities on their balance sheets, and so corporations are withdrawing from supporting the field of pensions provision. An enormous impact. China, in contrast, well, has relatively low pension expectations and currently is spending 2.2% of GDP on pensions, perhaps rising to 2.6%. The overall cost of aging in China is going to increase by 65%, but from a very low base, and it's likely to reach a figure that will be still less than 7%. And although the one-child policy has unquestionably distorted China's demographics, and also the number of people in work in China is going to peak at some time over the next 20 or 30 years, that will be a peak of 900 million working people, which declines to 800 million by 2050. But the process of urbanization, there are still nearly 500 to 600 million people in the rural countryside, not yet part of the modern economy. And during that same period, those people will be available to join their economy. When I was there 2 months ago, they were talking about the conscious design of many cities of 50 million people each. So, widening our evidence base to include non-public debt, Europe, with the exception of Germany, is carrying more debt than any other economic bloc in the world. In the UK, official statistics, and we're doing public and private now, show it as 380% of GDP. In Spain and France and Italy, it's 340 to 300. In the United States and Germany, it's below 300. In the new economies, the total debt of China is about 160% of GDP. In Russia, it's about 70%. Now, they've got their own issues and challenges, but their ability to absorb fiscal shocks, their ability to deal with new crises, and their flexibility for changing patterns of behavior in the future are far greater than our own. The other thing that we have done is import our credit. So we ourselves are unfundable in terms of our spending. And France and Swiss and German public and private sector debt is now 50% owned by creditors, external creditors. The reason that contagion, the central reason contagion is such a fear in the EU is the cross-holding of debt across national boundaries means that an event in Ireland is a pan-European event. By contrast, in the United States, external debt credit is only 20% of the economy. In Japan, it's 10%. So that leaves us to European savings rates, which again have been declining rapidly over the last 10 years. Now, from an economic perspective, domestic national savings are generally a good thing. They're a primary source of reinvestment into industry. Without them, an economy is forced to import credit the way we've described, And at a household, they do all the things that all of us in this room understand, providing buffers and protections against all sorts of contingencies. Between 1995 in the EU, we saw savings rates fall by a third, from 16 to 11% of disposable income on average. In the UK over the same period, we saw savings rates fall from 10% to 1%, and in the middle of the crisis they went negative. In comparison, in China, savings rates are of the order of 40%. So the first observation to be made is that these low savings rates and depressed returns are again insufficient to meet the future needs of our population. Again, putting the payment then for the liabilities into the next generation. It's a tough time to be saving. We face historically low interest rates, making short-term saving all but thankless. We face a range of tax distortions, particularly in relation to any form of savings in equities, which are the closest measure and access to the growing economy that any of us as individuals can get. And those tax distortions, coupled with the accounting changes, have brought about a large-scale de-equitization of the pension portfolios and removed a great slug of equity finance for companies and individuals looking for investment, because the equity finance of companies and the equity investment from individuals are two sides of the same coin. And again, they're fundamental aspects to economic growth and prosperity in a modern society. So we need to think really carefully about the solutions which will deliver safe investment returns and put capital to work to fund economic growth. Our systems of accountancy, customer risk profiling, and our inability to overcome the predictable irrationality of leading most of us to underestimate how much we'll need in the future, all, one way or other, need to be dealt with. The fourth and final defining characteristic of European economic model is that of business and government funding, which has grown excessively reliant on bank lending and is quite unlike the United States. Now, much of this is good, but in the Eurozone has developed into the largest market for bank finance in the world, with $21 trillion lent by banks each year, in addition to the $5 trillion lent just within the UK market. But in comparison, the UK equity markets are massively underdeveloped, where the comparison is the United States. And we see that the money raised on the primary markets in the EU is 5 times less than the money raised for equity investment in corporations and the wealth creation part of society, 5 times less than it is in the United States. And this balance between debt and equity is deeply important to the overall efficiency and safety of both the economy and our individual companies. Efficient capital markets are central to a thriving private sector. They're part of a funding environment able to offer a choice of capital raising mechanisms suitable for different stages of the business cycle. And if bank finance becomes the only or the overwhelming principal source of funding, in effect it becomes the principal risk capital provider and takes on the de facto ownership risks. And rationally what happens is that the banks will price accordingly and the cost of debt rises to meet equity. But then within this funding distortion, we meet the impact of taxation. And we see commentary from the IMF, the World Bank, and the McKinsey all saying that the monetary, fiscal, and regulatory environments throughout the West systematically undermine equity finance in comparison to debt. We give interest relief in a nutshell on debt, and we tax equity finance 4 times through its life cycle. So if we look at the overall impact on funding and compare it with the United States, 18% of business finance is delivered through bank debt in the United States. In the UK and across Europe, the weighting is closer to 50%. For those of us who are theoretical economists in here, Europe, in a sense, has walked away from the Modigliani-Miller model. It ceased to be relevant to thinking about how we raise finance. We'll need to rectify this if we're to compete. Half of the new private sector jobs generated in the recent years in the UK have been created by the fastest 6% of businesses, and they're all in the small and medium-sized enterprise category. In much of Europe, early-stage businesses are twice as likely to be invested in high-technology sectors as their Chinese peers. Blue-chip manufacturers have the internal and advisory resources to find efficient routes to capital and the buying power to secure good value. But many of the smaller companies are pre-profit for long periods of time, and they have few tangible assets from which to secure a loan. As a result, they're often unable to achieve debt financing either, but they need the support of specialized capital market infrastructure to make the transition from concept to commercialization. And again, the United States does this so much better than we do. Our current system is just proving really insufficient in this regard. And it's a huge concern that while 3% of SMEs have access to equity capital, 55% of SMEs use their credit cards as their primary source of funding, at interest rates in excess of 19%. The complexity and costs of equity capital raising are beyond the average small company management. And so we need a deep rethink about the provision of financial market infrastructure throughout the whole of Europe. So in conclusion, I've used this evening to define the 4 key areas in which Europe is in relative decline as a center of global economic influence. First, unsustainable public sector spending and the growing impact of our aging population, coupled with massive hidden liabilities, which will have to be paid for by future generations. Second, high levels of state economic participation, which is crowding out growth and innovation and leading to economic deserts in many areas of the UK. Third, low savings and investment behavior, which removes a major stabilizing force and potential pool of investment capital from the economy. And it jeopardizes the retirements of many in the private sector, and it places large additional tax burdens on all of us for the forward unfunded state sector pensions. And lastly, a business funding model too reliant on debt. The issues are hugely complex and politically challenging, but they must be addressed. And again, the current government needs our support in taking some necessary but difficult reforms. So as you next listen to George Osborne, I hope you do so from a different perspective. But we should also be clear about the extent of what is achievable. If we rectify this, as we re-emerge, Europe will be in a position of relative economic decline in global terms. Nothing to be concerned about, but there is no return to a position of economic dominance or a position from which you might be able to get your way by force. Today's European economic model could be characterized as a blend of what we might call the Anglo-Saxon model and the post-war social democratic tradition. The current balance has tipped too far towards the latter, and it requires some correction. As we start working towards building a new model, I can think of no better starting point than Friedman's observation that the greatest advances of civilization, whether in architecture or painting, in science and literature, in industry or agriculture, have never come from centralized government. Our economic future relies on freeing the phenomenal power of individuals and private endeavor within the common socio-democratic framework of the European Political Union. Thank you.